Welcome to the second part of my UV unwrapping, editing, and texturing tutorial for texturing mesh for Second Life. In this video, I will go over some of the basic ways you can apply textures to the mesh objects you make in Blender and upload into SL. First of all, in order to achieve a mesh object which can be textured in Second Life, there must be something called a material, along with any texture image you might want to bring into Blender or add later in a program like Photoshop or GIMP. So, what is the difference between a material and a texture in Blender? Some of you might already know this. Those new to Blender might find it helpful to know. But basically, in simple terms, a material is like a layer that holds information or properties, such as shading, specularity, transparency, and so on, which are assigned to your mesh. These properties can be controlled through the use of nodes, which I will make a separate video about, going into more detail, and through the Materials tab in the Properties panel, which is technically the same thing. So technically, what is a texture? A texture provides finer detail to the surface of your mesh object, which can make the mesh appear a certain way. Imagine a sidewalk and how its surface is not smooth, but broken up by the variation in the roughness you can see and feel if you touch it. So a texture, in our case, in our virtual environment, visually breaks up the surface of our mesh. Just as you saw, I had a wood texture applied to my object in the last tutorial video. So it, in a way, mimics an actual texture that might exist in the real world, for example, aged wood or fabric. You can then imagine how working with both material properties and textures combined can create some extremely photorealistic results. And that's also something I'll get into in more detail in another video. So the first thing we need to do before we can make our mesh texturable is to make sure we are working in cycles, because from what I know, you can't bake from Eevee in Blender 2.8 Plus. To do this, and I mean that might be something that's changed by the time this video is out, I have no idea, I'm not really an expert with Blender, I just use it in a basic way. So go up here to the tab, and this is in this middle section again, like in the last video, is the Properties panel or section. Go to the Render tab, which is the camera icon at the top, and when it says Render Engine, you want to change it from Eevee to Cycles. So that's something you always want to check if you feel like you can't find something like the bake button or whatever. Go to Render tab and check that you're actually in Cycles. Now, the first thing we want to do is learn how to create a material. So we need to create and apply a material onto the faces of our mesh object. Each mesh object, singular object in Second Life, meaning an unlinked object, can hold up to 8 different materials, which you can apply texture to. In other words, once you get the mesh in world, you can add up to 8 separate faces, or 8 separate textures onto your mesh in Second Life. If you wanted to use more than 8 materials on your mesh project in world, you would need to separate your mesh into multiple objects, which could then be uploaded as a link set from Blender, or you could upload them as individual objects and then link them once they are in world. So if you were creating a house, for example, you would need probably lots of link sets, because a house requires definitely more than 8 textures, most likely. So now, to create and apply our first material, go to the Properties panel here on my screen. It's on the right middle section, and scroll down to the Materials tab, which is the last sphere here on the bottom. I want to create a new material, so on the right, and also just a note, make sure you're in edit mode in order to do this. I didn't mention that, but hit the tab key just to make sure that you are actually in edit mode, which is where you would see everything selected. So back over here, hit the plus sign to add a new material slot. So this is where our first material will go. Now you want to hit the next button to actually add the material, and double click to name it if you want. I'm going to call mine My Material 1. Hit enter, And that's going to be my first material. The next and last step to applying the material is essential, so don't forget to do it. Go over to your mesh and select whichever faces you would like to have textured with your first material. So whichever faces you want to have assigned to this material, in order to apply a texture there, you want to do that now. So up here in the top right, make sure you're in face select mode here, and then I'm just going to select the top face of the mesh shape here, just so that I can show you how this works. So that's going to be one texture by itself. One material / texture by itself is this top face here. So over here on the right, I want to hit the assign button. This is absolutely essential, because if you were to take this mesh into Second Life before hitting the assign button, you would try to drop a texture image onto this face and it would look distorted because you did not assign this face to this material. So always hit assign button when you want to, connect a certain mesh face to a certain material. It has to create that link. So the next and last step to applying the material is to literally just, if you have any other faces you want to add to this material, you could select them and assign them. For this, this is just going to be one face to this material. I want to create a second one, so I'm going to repeat the process. So over here on the right side of the screen, click the plus button, then click new, and then double click and name this my material 2, enter. And then I'm going to go over here. I'm going to choose, I think, I'm gonna select these faces all around here, holding the shift button and left clicking in face select mode. And I'm pretty sure, would that work? That if I wanted to, I don't know why that's not working right now. Oh, there. So if I wanted a quicker way to select that loop of faces, remember in the last video we said that you could hold the Alt or on a Mac Option key and left click on a row of faces to select them all quickly. That's what I should have done in the first place. But anyway, so now that's all selected. This whole area that's highlighted is going to be assigned to my second material. So I'm going to go back over here to materials, click and highlight the second material, and click assign. So now these faces are connected to this second material. To see, before we add a third material, I want to show you how select and deselect work over here in materials. So over on the viewport, I'm going to double tap A to deselect everything. Then I'm going to go up here to the top button for the first material slot, select it, click select button, and as you see, it will automatically select the face that I assigned to the first material. Now, because I haven't added a third material yet, I haven't told Blender what to do with this bottom face. This is the remaining face that doesn't have a material of its own yet. It is going to automatically assign it to the first material. So just keep that in mind. You would just fix that by, if you want this to be separate, you would just do what we're going to do now, just create a third material. But I wanted to show you that first. Now if you go and click the second material, click select button, you can see that it will only select the faces you assigned to the second material. So it's just a quick way to kind of select your groups of faces together without having to do individual clicks. So I'm going to deselect all of that, and I'm going to go to the bottom of this mesh, left click to select the bottom face, and then I want to go back over here, click the plus button, click new, and I want to add a third material. So my material 3, hit enter, and then the next important step is to hit the assign button so that it tells this face to connect with this material. So now I have 3 different parts of my mesh which will be able to take a separate texture once I upload this object into Second Life. So that means that I could technically add 3 different textures to this mesh object as it is now. And remember, you can do up to 8 of these per singular object. So let's just quickly, let me show you. If you go into object mode and say you needed to have like more than 8 slots for texturing, you could make a copy of your mesh, Shift D. This is just a quick way to show this. I went over basics like copying in my first Blender tutorials. So then what I could do is I could go into edit mode on this, add another 8 slots, and then once I have these both assigned materials, I would hold Shift Select to select both of them, and then I would export these together. So then, I'd get one link set to upload into Second Life that would technically take 16 different textures, 8 per object, if that makes sense. So that was just a quick way to show you that that's what you can do to get more slots, more than 8 slots if you want to on a more complex project. Okay, back over here. Now I'm going to, now that I have my 3 materials, I'm going to stop there, and I want to just show you quickly how you can inverse select when you are in the process of like unwrapping and texturing your mesh. So let's say that I did want to add this a different way, like if I wanted to add a 4th texture or a 4th material or something like that. Another way to get faces selected is by the inverse. So like let's say that I selected the top face, which is the first material, and I could then hit, and I wanted to select the rest of the faces, but there were too many to sit there and click individually. I could hit Control I, and Control I is for inverse. So now that I hit that, what it did is it flipped the selection inside out. So instead of the top face being selected, it selected the remaining faces and left the top face open. So again, if I do, let me turn on my keys. I don't know why they keep disappearing. Anyway, I'll put the hotkeys on there. Control I on both Mac and PC, I can inverse the selection. So you see how that works. How that can probably help you in selecting lots of faces at once. So now that we have that, it is time to prepare the UV and texture map. Now that we have a basic understanding of getting materials started, we will work on our UV map. At this point, you should have your mesh already unwrapped. If you're unsure about how to do this, please see the first video in the tutorial on unwrapping. I will link it below. So as you can see, if I select everything, I have my mesh already unwrapped over here on the right in my UV editor. We did that before. We now need to create a blank image to bake any of our shading or texturing to. So, as you recall, if you watched part 1 of this tutorial on unwrapping, to create a blank UV map, we need to first open the UV editor, which, if you don't already have it open, you would just create another section on your screen, or go to UV editing tab to get the layout there. In my case, I like to have it over here, so you would click what would look like this hamburger icon here, and then just choose UV editor. And that's what we have here already. So, and I don't know why I'm in object mode. Okay, so I'm not going to go over the details of how to open the UV editor again, since I did that in the first video, but this is where we are. At the top of the UV editor, find the menu called Image, and then click New. Now let's name this object texture image 1, I'll say. Whoops. I don't know why my typing is so bad today. Okay. Object texture image 1, and I'm going to then, I would suggest actually leaving your image size at no less than 1024, because the smaller it is, the lower the resolution of the texture will be once it's in world. So the smaller it is, the more blurry it will look. Keep in mind though that larger images do take more time to res in SL. So I'm sure it's debatable about what size to make your images here, but this is just what my experience is. If you're making a very small object, like something that goes on part of jewelry, obviously it's okay to use a smaller size texture. If you're making something for like a large billboard or some large graphic display, or something where you want it to be nice and clear from far away, like a vendor, I would do it at a larger size. So make sure you uncheck alpha unless you want an transparent background on your UV map. I don't in this case. If you wanted to like bake out a shadow, you might want that. So you can change any of the other settings you like. Sometimes I just like to make this white. I mean, it doesn't really matter. It's going to bake out what it's going to bake out, and then click OK. So now we have a nice blank image, a new texture image or UV image to start out with. This blank image that will be your texture map is what Blender will bake shadows, lighting, texture, and material properties onto, depending on what you choose to include in your bake. So that will make more sense later. I want to go over a few different ways to bring in texture to Blender to apply to your mesh and to your UV map image here. Over to the right of your screen in the Properties panel, go to the Materials tab and scroll down until you find Base Color. And we did do this sort of quickly in the last tutorial video. So you want to click the yellow dot and choose Image Texture, because this is how we're going to bring in that wood texture I used before into Blender. So then click Open, and I'm going to go to my desktop, and here it is. Open, so you would just go to your computer wherever you have texture stored that you want. In order to see the texture we uploaded, if you don't already have this section or this option enabled, at the top of your screen in the center, look for the third from the left sphere called Material Preview or Lookdev. Click that to enable the ability to see the texture. Now, if you notice, this is something that I need to point out here. It only shows the texture, if I deselect here, on the top face, which the reason for that is because if we go back to back up here in Materials, whatever settings we apply down here, which these are essentially nodes, will apply to this material that's selected. So if I wanted the wood to be on all of these faces, but I want to keep my materials separate, I could just go to each one and do the same thing, like upload the image texture. There might be a faster way to do this, but this is just what I know right now in this case. So in this case, this could be a totally different texture to place on here. I'm just using the same one for the sake of time. And then I would go back up here and click on my material 3 and then go down and do the same thing. Base color, image texture, open for the texture, and open image. So now I have the whole mesh has the same texture applied. But again, you could do this however you wanted to do it. If you obviously only had one material, then all of these faces would be textured the same texture from the start. So that's something to keep in mind, is that adding texture and changing properties here will only work per material. You can copy the settings of one material to another without having to go and set all of the same properties up for each individual material to save you some time. So in order to do that, let's tab into edit mode on our object. And now we can see we have the wood texture on all 3 of the material slots on the mesh, but I'm going to bring in just a second texture just to show you how this works. So in the materials window, I'm going to go down to base color, click the yellow dot, choose image texture, choose, it's called patchwork. Open that. As you can see, I have the texture on the first material slot. So if I scroll back up to the materials window here, I'm going to make sure I just again have that material 1 selected, and then over here on the right side you'll see a caret or a drop down menu. Click that and choose copy material, and then I'm going to go over here to my material 2 slot, or the material that you want to copy the settings to, and then go back to the little drop down menu on the right and choose paste material. And as you can see, it has copied the settings for material 1 onto the faces assigned to material 2. So that would work with any of the settings you've changed in the properties, either in nodes or here in the materials window or section. It's not just for the texture, but if you changed any of these values, it would just copy everything from one material to the next. So over on the right, we're in the materials area still. We can see our texture. Next, I'm going to talk about using nodes. Whether you are using the settings in the materials tab, just like I did when I added, the image texture here, you are still essentially using those little boxes with strings called nodes. It is just that you can't see them in the properties panel. You must go to the shader editor in order to work with these settings in a visual node layout. If you want to do that, that is what I will show you to do now, because that's just how I work now in Blender. Again, that's up to you. Down here where I have my blank UV image, in the same window as the UV editor, I want to go to this top little icon here, the menu for UV editor, and I want to go and choose shader editor. So this is where you will be able to edit nodes. Here you will see a few default nodes there, like principal, BSDF, and material output, which is always needs to be there. I will get into more information about those in a later video in terms of what nodes you could have here, what they would do, how you would connect them. For now, I'll just show you how to plug things up in a basic way so that you can see a texture on your mesh and get a basic understanding of how nodes can be part of setting up your UV map and texturing process. So to zoom in on the shader editor, you just do this, use the same keys as you would in the UV editor, or actually in the 3D viewport. You can hit Control and middle mouse wheel to get in closer here. You could hold Shift. It should be Shift. On the Mac, it's like Option or something to pan. It's a different key, but on the PC, it should be Shift to pan the editor left to right. I don't know why it's not working on mine. Anyway, I'll go more into detail on how to do that in a better way in the video that I make on nodes. So basically, next we're going to add a new node, because what we have here is so far the texture that we added, which is for me called old wood planks. When I added this up in the materials properties here, when I clicked the yellow dot and opened that texture, it automatically opened a new node, which you can see here. And if you zoom in, if I zoom in, you can see, don't know how well you'll be able to see this. It's the same thing, old woods planks. So this node is just for that texture that you see, the wood texture here. And it's already connected to the principal BSDF and then to the material output. So I know that doesn't make sense right now for those of you new to nodes, but don't worry about it for now. Just know that this is what's going on behind the scenes. So we want to add a new image texture here in the node shader editor. The image texture node is, just to tell you quickly, which is always orange at the top, is used to apply an image to your mesh in Blender. So what we want to do though, because we need to add another texture, or actually we need to add another node in order to tell Blender where we want to bake our shading and lighting. So over here on the blank image that we created, that we called, what was it, object texture image, we need to go back in the shader editor and tell Blender through nodes that we want any baking that we do to show up not on this texture, because this is just our wood, but we want it to show up on a new node for that blank image. So let's go Shift-A to add a new node, texture, and then image texture. So then this gives us a new node. So we're just going to drag it. You can make this bigger if you want. Drag it out. It doesn't need to be connected to this. It's just telling Blender that here's the texture we want to bake onto. So we select Object, Texture, Image here in this drop-down menu to the left. So again, this little drop-down menu, you just find that blank image that you created in the UV editor a minute ago. I named it Object, Texture, Image. You can name it whatever you want. So keep this in mind that when you do add this, you need to make sure that before you bake, and I probably will bring this up later again, you need to have this is the node that you need to have selected with this green outline. This needs to be the active node before you get ready to do your final bake. That doesn't make sense now, but it will later. So everything is fine how it is now. So in this tutorial, I won't be going over lighting and such, but I will show you how to do a basic bake and get a texture map based on what we've done so far that could be used to upload an SL. Having made sure that I have my object texture image node selected in the shader editor, I can now go to the properties section, which is the middle section here for me, to the little camera icon at the top, which is the render tab, and scroll all the way down until I see bake, which is right here. And there's the bake button. Before hitting the bake button, check the drop down under it and make sure that you are going to bake the right set of properties that you want to show up on your new blank UV texture map. So in my case, I want to leave the option on combined. This is that menu here. You have options here. You have that you can bake only shadow if you want. You can bake ambient occlusion if you want, which gives you like lighting and shading based on proximity of objects to each other. You could do any of these individually if you just want those separate maps. But I'm going to leave it on combined so I can get everything baked out, meaning the texture that I have here, the wood texture, and any ambient occlusion that is there, that's basic. I mean, I haven't done anything for lighting for this. So everything's default and basic. So now I will click bake, and let's see if I did this all and didn't miss any steps. And down here at the bottom, you will see your progress for the bake. It was pretty fast because I didn't, change anything. How fast or slow this bake goes will depend on your render settings in Blender. In the render tab, if you scroll up to the top and you see, where is it? Oh, here it is. Render is at 128. If I wanted to get a higher resolution render, obviously when I do that, it's going to take longer for Blender to bake this image out. In terms of what number to have this at, I mean, you have to go according to how long you're willing to wait, what quality you want. I guess just do whatever quality you can handle. Some people with older computers might not be able to handle very much, and it would take a very long time, maybe an hour or something to bake. If you're willing to do that, then do that. If you don't and need to bake at a lower quality that you could get away with, then do that. It's all according to you and your hardware and your project. Just know that this is where you can control that here. And then viewport, this number here is what quality can you see in the viewport. So if I were to go here to render, like full render preview, see how it's like kind of grainy when I move and zoom in and stuff like that. I could increase this way up, and then that would give me a clearer image here, like a clearer preview of what things are looking like. I usually just leave this down though, especially for this case. So I'll just leave things, pretty low. I'll go back to material preview mode. Okay, so what I need to do, because you can see we only have the wood on the top face, is make sure that for each, go back in the materials area, for each material that I have, since I have 3 here, I want to make sure that I go to the shader editor down here, which I'm already there, and make sure that I have added that new image, which was Shift-A, that image texture node, and assigned it to my bake map, which is object texture image. So make sure that if I want everything to bake on one map, for these three materials that I would make sure that for each material I have an image texture node that is assigned to object texture image. So for all three, you want the same setup in nodes. So now that I have that, I can see what baked. Go to shader in the shader editor, click the menu thing and go to UV editor to go back to UV editor, and you can see that this is our final bake image. So this includes any default lighting that's in Blender right now. We do have a lamp here, and any shading shadows at this point without us doing anything fancy, just trying to show you how this process works in a basic way. So as you can see, it includes a little bit of shadows here. This doesn't look bad as it is. I mean, there's lots more you could do here for photorealism, but not too bad for doing nothing fancy. So let's say that this is good and this is what you want to do, is to have this as your image texture, and you just want to save it out and upload it to SL. You could do that at this point. You would be done. To do that, make sure that you are in edit, and then just go to the image menu here at the top of the UV editor, choose save as, and save it onto your computer wherever you would want to save it. That's up to you. And then you could take the image into Photoshop and tweak it, or you could just upload this directly into SL as it is. If you wanted, since I have three different materials here, like say that I wanted a different bake map for each of these different materials, all you would do is, for like say material number 2, if I wanted that to be a separate bake map, you would go image, new, and then let's call it like object texture image 2, click OK, and then now I would go back to shader editor for this second material slot, shader editor, and then I would just change here on the drop down, change it to object texture image 2. So now when I would go to bake, up at the render tab, all the way down to bake, it will bake the texture, all of that for material 2 on this object texture image 2. So you'll see what I mean in a second here. Now let's go over back to UV editor so we could see now it's the same thing, but if you wanted this to have like a different texture or something else set up for the second material slot, then you would do that. I just wanted to show you that these things could be baked out separately and everything doesn't have to go all in one bake map or UV map. So hopefully that makes sense. Another way to add texture to a UV map, if you don't want to do it through Blender and through nodes, as for like the texture part, like the wood or the fabric, you could use like a program like Photoshop or GIMP. In this tutorial, I will be using Photoshop just to show you how you can do this. I won't go into details about texturing in these graphic editing programs, but I will just show you basically how to get the files set up so that you can add texture that way. So I'll save like details and tips for that, for texturing like in Photoshop or GIMP, for a separate video to go into more detail. So if you're happy with what you have here, you could just stop there. If you want to just get a blank map with just the lights and shading, you would go over to the render tab up here at the top, click the camera icon, scroll all the way down, and under the bake button you would choose, instead of combined, because you don't want to bake out this wood texture, you would choose ambient occlusion. And now you can go back to the UV, well, we're already in the UV editor, and let's do a bake and see what it gives us. So there isn't much here. I don't have ambient occlusion turned on actually. If we go to the world tab, that might change it. And click ambient occlusion. This is in the world tab, which is like this middle sphere. Let's go back to render, which is the camera button, and go back down to bake and bake. And I don't know what it'll do because there isn't another object in here. yeah, it's like the same thing. But anyway, if I did have like a second object in here that was close to this one, it would probably have some more defined shadows. But this is just to show you that this is how you would get that blank black and white AO map that you've heard of in SL. The AO map is what we typically call it, you know, with like the texture, the mesh template kits, and just everyone kind of knows what AO map is. So it would just give you that blank texture with the simple shading and lighting on it, so that you could take this into Photoshop and lay over the texture there if you wanted to do it, instead of bringing the texture into Blender. So another thing I want to show you to do before we leave Blender is this can help you in texturing over a big map in an outside editing program like Photoshop. You can export your UV layout. So if we go back into edit mode, and if we select everything, whoops, all the mesh over here, and go to the UV menu up here, and then go all the way to the top, to the very top, click export UV layout, then you can save on your desktop whatever you want to call this UV map. I'll call it okay, that's just for lack of a better name, and then just save it out onto your wherever, so that when I go here to Photoshop, which you will see in a second, I can then go to Open, and on my desktop I have my texture, so open the texture, the wood planks. So this is just like when I opened it in Blender, and then go open again, go back to where I downloaded my UV layout that I just exported, open that. So what I want to do is open my AO, my big map, which go to open, and I want to open the blank one because I'm going to apply my texture like manually. Okay, so here it is. These should all be the same size. That's one thing. They should all have been saved as 1024, so that, well, the texture can be whatever size, but the UV layout should be 1024. So with the UV exported UVs file open, I'm going to hit Control or Command A to select all, Control or Command C to copy, and then come over here and edit. You want to go to the top. Don't do Control V because it'll paste it wherever. You want to go to Edit, Paste, Special, Paste in Place. This is if you're in Photoshop. For GIMP, it's probably another way that I will put in a featured video, because I personally don't use GIMP, but I will add that to the cheat sheet that I make for this video for GIMP users. So now we have it placed perfectly where it is in Blender, and whatever we put in these areas will show up on those corresponding faces on the mesh. So I'm going to just act like I want to. Well, first let's name this layer as UV layout. That's kind of what I like to do. And then this is like the AO map, or whatever you want to call it. And then I want to go over here to my texture, hit Control or Command A to select all, Control or Command C to copy. This I can just do Control V or Command V, and then you see I have my texture. Now I can lay this out however I want. I can you know, scale this texture up or down with, you know, Control or Command T. I could leave it as is, whatever. I'm going to leave it kind of as is, and then I'm going to go over here into this first, let's name it wood texture. You might end up working with multiple different textures on one map, so you definitely want to get in the habit of labeling your layers. And then over here at the top where it says normal, I want to drop down and go to multiply. So if I turn this off, you can see it's hard to see that anything changed, but there's such little shading here, but you would see that the texture is like an overlay now, and any shading, any darker shading will be visible through the texture. Let me just do something very simple and like a messy way to show you what I'm talking about. So if this AO map had some darker shading underneath, let's give that a blur. Like say that it had that, as you can see, even though the texture, the wood texture is on top, since I have it on multiply, it will now show through, and you'll have your combination of your shadows plus your texture visible on the map. You can play with this. Sometimes you might want like a different type of layout, or not layout, but overlay. That's up to you. I usually just use multiply. So that is a basic way showing you how to do this manually yourself in like Photoshop or something, instead of doing the texturing in Blender. Also, you can just open, if I were to go to File, Open on the desktop, my desktop, let's just open the baked image I did in Blender, where I had the texture all and everything was done in Blender. This is kind of dark, so I could just tweak this and edit it how I want if I like that. I could go here to the bottom of the layers window to levels to add an adjustment layer in Photoshop. I can do a separate video on this. I know I say that for everything. Levels is a way of, or an adjustment layer is a way of changing properties of the image without directly changing the image. It just puts kind of like a layer on top so you can tweak things. And then you can just delete the layer if you don't like it. So here I'm just going to, like, if I wanted to make this like a lighter texture, not so dark, I could play with these values here. Or if I didn't want to do that, let's say that I wanted to, I could delete that adjustment layer and add like a hue saturation adjustment layer, click colorize, and then I could change the color of, and then also the lightness or darkness of the texture. So this is something that I commonly do all the time when I'm texturing my items for SL. So you can see the possibilities here. This just gives you an idea of what you can do, different ways to texture your stuff. So next I'm going to show you how to upload your mesh and texture and apply it into Second Life. Okay, so before we jump over into SL to upload this and view it, notice that at the top we're in this material preview Lookdev mode. If you go over to the right and click render view, you'll see that really we don't have any good lighting set up, so things are pretty dark. We're going to leave that as it is for now because this video is not about that, about lighting. We just want to be able to see that the texture is there and go with that. So you would export your object by going to File, Export, click Selection Only, and save it to your desktop. I've already done that. So now over in SL, you would have gone to the top of the screen to build, upload model, mesh model. And then on my desktop, I want to choose my object, click open, and here it is. We can see. I'm not going to do any fancy settings. This is not a video for LODs or anything like that, so I'm just going to use the default settings and click calculate, upload. And now I want to drag the cube out. And so once you have it in, now I'm going to show you how to preview the texture that we made for it, that bake map, but without having to pay the 10 linden to upload it until we're sure that it's what we want. So this is just the basic process I go through when I texture mesh. So click the texture box in the edit menu, and that's, again, if you aren't familiar with basic SL editing, it's right click on the object, click edit, go to the texture tab here and click on the texture box, go to local because we don't have anything in our inventory for this mesh yet. Go to add, and then on your computer find where you saved that bake map and click OK. And now it's on the mesh just like it was in Blender. So obviously If we wanted things like this, it would be fine and ready to package or do script whatever we want to do. If we wanted to change the lighting so that we had, could view the texture all the way around and make it a better map, we could do that, and keep previewing it this way through local textures. Keep in mind that when this process that we just did with previewing the texture for free through local textures is called local textures, and by letting us see the texture on our screen, it is only visible to us, to our avatar. So if somebody were to teleport in, they would not see this wood texture, they would see gray. So that's the only thing about local textures. When you are using them, before you finalize your product and package it to sell, make sure that you have actually uploaded, by file upload image, the object texture image, the final bake map that you want to put on your object. Make sure you upload that, get it into SL, and put it onto your mesh. Otherwise, you will have this gray texture that other people won't know what it's supposed to be. So let me just show you quickly, though, how we still have our 3 material slots that we made in Blender, which means that this mesh can currently hold up to 3 separate textures if we wanted it to. Since my whole object is wood, this is just for the tutorial, I didn't want to make 3 separate textures, but you could, and then you could upload them separately. So there's this top face, which was material 1, and let me just color it a different color to show you this concept. So there it's like a pink color. Material 2 is in the center, and we could essentially color that or texture it something different, blue. And then on the bottom, select, and by the way, this is in having face select or select face marked in the edit menu in order to select these faces if you aren't familiar with SL editing. The bottom face is the material slot 3, and I could then texture that separately, and I'm not sure if it will show up. It won't show up, but it's a third face down here that can take a third texture if you wanted to. So I hope that shows you all the capabilities that are there. So just be careful what you're doing. You're going to run into mistakes. You're going to have to stop along the way and go to Google and type in what problem you're having with Blender if something's not going right, or you can come to me and message me in World or somewhere on YouTube, leave a comment or email or my website, and let me know if you're having a problem. It most of the time will end up coming down to something very basic that we just overlooked. I have been using Blender for years, and I still run into little things that I miss or make a mistake on. So this concludes my very basic demonstration, which hopefully points you in the right direction for getting started with unwrapping and then texturing your mesh and your mesh objects in Second Life. I know this can feel like an overload of information, so please don't worry if you feel overwhelmed. This is totally normal. With repetitive practice, this will all become very easy to use, or very easy for you to do over time. So don't worry. If I missed anything, or you have any questions you want to ask about any part of this process, or if you have any questions about anything in general that I might be able to help with, please don't hesitate to let me know here in the comments, again, on my website, in my email, or here in World and Second Life. I am here for you. So also please see the link to my form in the description area if you'd like to submit any ideas for topics for videos or anything like that. Do let me know, because I would love to know exactly what you need help with the most. So I'd love to know what everyone is doing out there, how everyone is doing with Blender, old and new versions, and their creative projects for Second Life. Thank you so much for watching and hanging in there with me. I know this was a long one. That was a long time coming. Happy creating!